Hey there, everybody. Seja here, founder of the School of Evolutionary Herbalism, and welcome back to the Plant Path. You know, one of the number one reasons why people go to the doctor is these days, it's actually fatigue. And I think this is not surprising. More and more fatigue is a common complaint amongst modern human beings. And it's one of the major reasons why they go to the doctor. And I think this means that we need to consider this and understand it on a deeper level and have good therapeutic strategies for how to address the fatigued client. Because if you are practicing clinical herbalism, it is guaranteed that you will see many, many clients where fatigue is one of their primary complaints. And I think it's important to understand some of the physiology behind fatigue, some of the reasons people get fatigued, how kind of some of the modern cultural dynamics contribute to fatigue. But I think there's also an importance to discuss the role of herbal medicine in addressing fatigue, specifically from the lens of this very powerful class of herbal medicines that we call adaptogens. And I want to talk about this today because adaptogens are amazing plants, but I feel like there is a lot of common misunderstanding about what plants actually are adaptogens, what adaptogens do, and most importantly, how to appropriately use adaptogens for the fatigued client. And when I say that latter piece, it's really when is it appropriate and when is it inappropriate to use adaptogens, because I think they're really commonly seen as this panacea, this incredible source of free energy, basically, that you can use without altering any of your lifestyle or dietary modifications and things like that, which can make the herbalist overlook some of the actually really obvious contributing factors to fatigue that adaptogens don't actually address. So I want to talk about all of that here in this episode. Thanks so much for taking the time to tune in. And if you enjoy some of the content that I share on this channel, one of the ways that you can support is to like and subscribe and join the Evolutionary Herbalism community. Get updates whenever we're publishing new free content. So fatigue. I think it's really important to differentiate stages of fatigue. You know, there's the obvious, I feel tired because I stayed up really late last night and I had to wake up early. This is more of a short-term fatigue that is pretty straightforward and obvious in that you just simply didn't get enough sleep that night. When we're speaking of more of a chronic fatigue type situation, this is a constant, heavy, dragging physical and psychological exhaustion that simply does not let up. Someone feels tired all the time, and it's not exactly easily cause and effect for them to be aware of. It's not like, oh, I stayed up till 2 o'clock in the morning and had to wake up at 5 to go to work. It's, I still got a decent night's sleep and I'm still tired all the time. And you have to understand the state of someone that is going to call the doctor, make an appointment, drive all the way across town to go to that appointment and sit there and talk to them because they are tired all the time. This is significant. This is not just the whiny, complaining, oh, I'm tired all the time. This is, you know, it's affecting work performance, it's affecting family life, it's affecting psychological and emotional health. You have to understand what's going on within someone to get them to the point where they're sitting in front of you or a doctor to talk about their fatigue. So why do we get fatigued? How does our cultural model tend to support fatigue? And how does our lifestyle generate fatigue? And most importantly, what can we do about it? So first, let's talk about some of the obvious causes of fatigue. The first one is, again, these are obvious, would be lack of sleep. Now, oftentimes when people talk about sleep, it's really spoken of quantitatively, i.e., how many hours of sleep did you get? While that can be something to consider, I think a more important question is the quality of sleep. Specifically, is someone getting into those deeper stages of sleep that provide the physiologically restorative quality that sleep provides for especially the neuroendocrine system? And fatigue that is, a one-shot fatigue because you didn't get enough sleep typically is simply remedied by getting some sleep. But when we have more of this long-standing chronic fatigue, sometimes people can get a little lack of sleep here and there, and it's not that big of a deal. But what we see culturally is that it's very common for people on average to be getting not only low quantity of sleep, but low quality of sleep. They're being frequently woken up through the night. They don't drop into those deeper states of restorative sleep. So even if they get 7 or 8 hours of sleep, they're not getting deep enough and they're still waking up very fatigued and not feeling well rested, which when you're doing an intake for someone on fatigue, doing a very deep dive investigation of not just quantity, but quality of sleep is very important. And one of the most important questions there is actually, do you wake up feeling well rested? And if the answer to that question is a consistent no, then that is something that absolutely needs to be looked into. Second, we have constantly pushing oneself beyond capacity. So this can take the form of athletes very commonly do this. They push themselves beyond their physiological capacity towards exhaustion. This can be very hard on the neuroendocrine system over prolonged periods of time. This also has to do with chronic stress. So if you are constantly in a sympathetic state of your autonomic nervous system, this is very exhausting on a physiological level. I'm not just saying, I feel tired, but literally on a physiological level in the body, it's very, very depleting. People talk about, aging. Well, one thing that is going to make you age quickly is chronic stress. Your whole endocrine system, the whole functioning of the sympathoadrenal system, which is where your sympathetic nervous system and the adrenal aspect of the endocrine system kind of link together. When that becomes excessive, it is very, very depleting for the body on multiple levels. So the chronic stress piece is very important, and it's contributing factor to chronic fatigue. We would also see associated with that is immune deficiency, because when people tend to have chronic stress, chronic sleep issues, we see that the immune function is decreased. And from an astrological medicine perspective, this is all the axis of Mars. Mars governs the stress response, the sympathoadrenal system, and also the immune system. When one is in excess, the other is in deficiency, and vice versa. When that stress response becomes more moderated, then our immune function tends to be heightened and much more efficient. And lastly, I'm saying obvious causes of fatigue. This one is not as obvious to most people, but this is critically important for the fatigued patient. If we think of energy, right, with fatigue, everyone always says, my adrenals are burned out. My adrenals are burned out. It must be my adrenals. A lot of time it's not your adrenals. Your adrenals are not what give you energy on a consistent basis. Sure, they give you those bursts of energy under periods of stress through secreting, adrenaline and noradrenaline and cortisol and all of that. But if you think of it on a cellular level, what generates energy is the mitochondria. And that is the generation of ATP, adenosine triphosphate. This is cellular energy. This is what literally every cell in your body uses as its primary energy source. And it is manufactured through a biochemical cycle called the Krebs cycle. And when we look at the biochemistry of the Krebs cycle, we see that there are fundamental enzymes and intermediates that are required for that cycle to effectively generate adequate amounts of ATP to maintain your energy levels. And if you look at those, we find critical nutrients such as magnesium, one of the primary minerals that is devoid in much of the modern human diet because of the soil being depleted of magnesium. This is what technically classifies a B vitamin. So a lot of our B vitamins are Krebs cycle intermediates, along with many amino acids, which are derived from protein. So if you couple magnesium deficiency with B vitamin deficiency with insufficient protein in the diet, we will have deficient Krebs cycle intermediates, which affects mitochondrial health, which affects energy levels. And I don't care how much ashwagandha, eleuthero, rhodiola, Asian ginseng you take, if you are deficient in the fundamental nutrients that are responsible for making that Krebs cycle hum along smoothly and efficiently, you will ultimately not correct the underlying pathophysiology of fatigue, which is multifactorial, but the nutrition is critical here. So this is an important point in addressing fatigue that I think it's very easy for the modern herbalist to overlook, because we hear fatigue and our mind immediately goes to adaptogens. Don't think that way. You will miss the mark many times. So these are some of the obvious aspects of fatigue. And notice none of those really equals adaptogen deficiency, right? Oftentimes we can correct fatigue simply by aiding someone in getting deeper restorative sleep and getting them optimally nourished. That is the foundation for addressing fatigue, not just offhandedly throwing crazy strong adaptogen formulas at people all the time. Now, I'm not saying adaptogens don't have their place. Obviously, that's what I'm going to be talking about here. But I feel like in order to talk about adaptogens and their use in fatigue, it's very important to talk about some of these underlying factors, which are really central to a holistic and vitalist approach to herbal medicine. Now, the other thing that I want to say is that fatigue's not always just fatigue. Fatigue can be a sign or a symptom of sometimes much more serious illness that people are experiencing. So, for example, people with cancer tend to be very fatigued. People with chronic systemic inflammation tend to be fatigued. People with autoimmunity tend to be fatigued. People with immunodeficiency, or what's sometimes called CFIDS, chronic fatigue immunodeficiency syndrome, post-viral syndrome can generate fatigue. Heck, food intolerance can generate fatigue. So this is another reason why we can't just give the fatigued patient adaptogens right off the bat. Sometimes we need to investigate things more deeply. Sometimes we need to refer them to get further screening and testing done to make sure that there isn't something much deeper going on with the client whose primary complaint is fatigue. So you can't just give adaptogens. You have to assess the diet, the lifestyle, nutritional factors, and make sure there isn't something more serious going on for your fatigued clients. And you really have to be rational and logistical in your approach, in the sense of like be logical in thinking about these underlying contributing factors. Now, nonetheless, adaptogens are incredible plants. So I want to clarify exactly what an adaptogen is and is not, what some of their properties are, and what can we expect from them, and go over some of the materia medica. So what is an adaptogen? So this is a newer concept in regards to how we might classify certain medicinal plants. This was developed by Russian scientists in the mid-20th century in their research to find ways to enhance productivity and performance of the working class, of their military, of athletes, especially without using amphetamines, right? That was a major thing, that we saw, for example, say in World War II. Amphetamines were used quite liberally, and to enhance productivity, performance, especially, obviously in the military. And as we now know, those are not good drugs for people to be using really at all, and definitely not on a consistent basis. So the Russians were really interested in finding natural alternatives. And we find there's specific definitions, there's requirements that a substance has to meet in order to be classified as an adaptogen. And I really like to stress this point because I hear all the time all these people calling herbs adaptogens when they clearly don't understand what an adaptogen is and what the criteria are. Like, for example, I keep hearing it, a lot of people saying cannabis is an adaptogen. Cannabis is not an adaptogen. I don't care what people say. It does not meet the criteria. It's a medicine. It has medicinal properties when used properly. But adaptogen, no, not an adaptogen. So there are three primary things that qualitative factors that a plant needs to meet to be classified as an adaptogen. For one, it has to have a non-specific action in the body by enhancing the body's capacity to resist environmental, physical, psychological, and emotional stressors. Now, what's interesting about that is that it's non-specific, which means in a way it's hard to pin down. But the way this was tested classically was through stress tests on mice. It's pretty brutal, actually. They would do the swim test on mice, where they drop mice in a pool of water and see how long they swim before they give up. And then they would administer a substance and see, does it make the mouse swim for longer? I.e., does it allow that mouse to essentially resist those stressors that are placed on its system? Another qualifying factor, must be non-toxic. And third, they must help the body maintain and re-regulate homeostasis by normalizing organ system function. So again, these are all very vague kind of terms, but that's the kind of the case, is that they are specifically vague. It's not, the definition of an adaptogen isn't that, it must bind, it has to have these chemicals that bind to this receptor that has this specific result. It's more, no, this is a very general quality that generally they have to have these results. Now, there's a few modern theories of how adaptogenic substances are able to achieve this ultimate result of allowing the body to adapt to changing circumstances and help specific organs maintain homeostasis. Generally speaking, the most accepted modern theory is that they are acting on the hypothalamic pituitary adrenal axis, as well as the SAS, or the sympathoadrenal system. These systems, now note, I didn't say adrenal glands, okay? we're speaking of, because and with endocrinology, it's very difficult to isolate a single endocrine gland or single organs, because all these endocrine glands have these very intricate feedback loop mechanisms where something goes up and it turns this one off, and then that substance goes down, and then because it goes down, it flips another switch that turns that on, that turns that on, that goes downstream. They are cascades, and they're all very much so interconnected. But what we find with the HPA axis and the SAS is that this is a very wide-reaching, broad spectrum system involving the nervous system and the endocrine system that then affects a host of physiological dynamics within the body, including immune system functioning, nervous system functioning, cardiovascular and flow of blood throughout the system, and of course the endocrine system. So these are all what I like to think of as systemic systems, right? Your nervous system scattered through your whole body. Endocrine system affects everything. Immunity affects everything. It's throughout the entire body. These systems are at the foundation of regulating, in a sense, the whole physiological organism. Now, when we look on a more biochemical level, we see very commonly these substances affect very specific markers, specifically catecholamines, cortisol, serotonin, nitric oxide, many different inflammatory markers and immune markers such as eicosanoids, cytokines, as well as influencing sex hormones in some, such as testosterone, estrogen, in some cases DHEA, etc. So we see that these plants with this adaptogenic quality seem to thematically influence the body on these levels. Now, they're not all created equal, and this is very important too, where it's very easy for people to think, oh, adaptogens all essentially do the same thing. This is a very simplistic way of thinking about these herbs that is wrong and can inevitably lead you to select the wrong ones. They all have very different qualities. Some of them are calming, some of them are stimulating, some of them are hot, some of them are warm, some of them are very, very drying, some of them are slightly moistening, some influence the nervous system more, some influence more the cardiovascular system, some are more immunologically oriented. They all have their nuance. And understanding the specificity of those nuances is critical for getting specific in selecting the appropriate adaptogen for your client. Remember, we don't just give adaptogens for fatigue. We give adaptogens for a person with a broad constellation of symptomatic patterns that should be addressed by proper selection of the specific adaptogen that matches that constellation. Now we see that many adaptogenic remedies obviously have other properties. So some tend to be more nervine and some stimulate the nervous system actually. Some can calm and relax the nervous system. Some of this is very dose dependent too. So if you take a moderate amount of it, it will be more calming. If you take a crazy large amount or a really concentrated extract, they can be very stimulating. Some of them have nootropic qualities and really aid in cognitive health, right? Mental focus, concentration, memory, things like that. Many of them will be inflammation modulating. Some of them have very profound influences on the immune system in the sense of some are very amphoteric, meaning that they have the ability to fine-tune immunological excesses and deficiencies, which, just to note on the side here, that many autoimmune conditions Oftentimes people think autoimmunity is immune excess. It's actually significantly more complicated than that. Many autoimmune conditions have attributes of immune excess and immune deficiency at the same time, or cycling through waves of immune excess followed by periods of immune deficiency. Basically, the immune system is totally out of sync with itself. And so the immune amphoterics and immunoregulators can really help to tamp down those excesses, strengthen those deficiencies. Very, very useful class of plants here. We have some adaptogens that are very well suited for autoimmune type conditions, and autoimmunity over the long term can have drastic impacts on the HPA axis, the sympathoadrenal system, because when you're inflamed all the time, that's a stress on the body, right? We tend to think of stress as, oh, I've got a deadline, or I just ran 20 miles and my body just went through this period of stress, or I'm getting chased by a bear in the woods. But there's also physiological stress, that it's not like the feeling of being stressed the way I think a lot of people tend to think of it. If you're chronically inflamed all the time on a biochemical and physiological level, that is stress to the body that can be very, very depleting over the long term. We also find that many adaptogens have very potent antioxidant properties. And actually, it was once theorized that it was the antioxidant attribute of adaptogens that was how they worked. This is definitely far from the truth, because we have many plants are powerfully antioxidant, but not even remotely close to being adaptogenic. So those two are very distinct properties, but many adaptogens are notably antioxidant, but that doesn't mean that all antioxidants are adaptogenic. There's some other interesting evidence about adaptogens in their capacity to actually protect the mitochondria, which, as noted, these are the energy generating organelles of the cell for manufacturing ATP. There's been some interesting research around adaptogens influencing and protecting mitochondria, possibly through their effect on what are called heat shock proteins. So there's lots of interesting research out there on some possible pharmacological mechanisms of action for adaptogens. But what we do know is that these are complex remedies that do complex things in the body. And I think we're really only beginning to scratch the surface in understanding what they're doing on a biochemical level. But regardless of that, what's most important is observing their medicinal virtue and what they're actually, how they're actually healing the body. Now, there are some overlap with adaptogens and some more traditional, how would you say, classification of plants, especially in Eastern systems of herbal medicine. But I do think it's important to differentiate them a little bit. So, for example, we have a class of medicine in Ayurveda called rasayana, which typically are considered rejuvenative herbs that help to, build, strengthen, rejuvenate the body or certain organ systems of the body. We also have the concept of the tonic herbs in Chinese medicine, whether that be qi tonics, and in particular, the kidney yin tonics and the kidney yang tonics. There can be some overlap in those herbs with adaptogens, but not all rasayanas are adaptogenic, and not all Chinese tonic herbs are necessarily adaptogenic. There are some overlap, but not all. So I don't think these categories are necessarily one-to-one in their associations, and I think that's an important thing to consider, that by definition, things have to meet those baseline criteria I went over earlier to be considered a true adaptogen. Now, before I talk about some of the herbs, I feel like there's some important aspects to talk about in terms of myths and misconceptions, dangers of misuse, and some classification dynamics of adaptogens. So just real quick, some myths and misconceptions. For one, they're good for everyone. Not true. Anytime anyone says this, that, or the other is good for everyone, run away. They don't know what they're talking about. This is just my opinion, but anytime anyone says adaptogens are for everyone, I don't think they really know what they're talking about. A lot of times people will say, oh, one adaptogen is every adaptogen. They're essentially all the same. Again, incorrect statement. All adaptogens have their uniqueness and their individuality, just like people. They're a panacea. These are not panaceas. They will not cure everything. They will not give you free energy. They will not fix a bad lifestyle. This is just not true. They're amazing herbs with amazing properties, but they will not fix everything without any effort on your part. And I think along with that, there can be a thought of taking them can be like a replacement for a healthy lifestyle. Like, oh, you don't need to get adequate quality sleep. You don't really need to eat that healthy. Just take adaptogens and you'll be healthy. This is a very bad approach from a therapeutic standpoint. And again, there's lots of herbs placed in this category by some folks that really don't belong in there. Some say turmeric is an adaptogen. Not true. Cannabis is an adaptogen. Not true. Gotu kola is an adaptogen. Not true. So there's a lot of herbs that are said to be adaptogens. And I think one of the big ones too is like, oh, anything wrong in your body, an adaptogen will just correct it. Oftentimes the term adaptogen and amphoteric are kind of misconstrued and overlapped with one another incorrectly. So it's very important to differentiate something that is amphoteric in nature versus adaptogenic. So that can be a misunderstanding that I see a lot out there. Now, they're great herbs, but they do have dangers associated with them, and they can be misused. So one thing that we see with adaptogens is if people take a lot of them in excess, there is a potential of enabling someone to push themselves beyond their physiological limit, which in the long run further promotes burnout. And, there's been research done on this with athletes that are using, say, cordyceps mushroom to aid in their athleticism. And sure, we might see improved metrics on their athletic performance, but upon follow-up, we can see that they actually are burning themselves out more because they're using the adaptogen to kind of override, in a sense, their baseline physiological mechanisms that says, hey, you're pushing it too far, slow it down, time to stop. So there can be a further promoting of burnout through the misuse of adaptogens. They can be used to mask deeper symptoms. Again, like I said, someone can have deeper disease present, of which fatigue is an attribute of that can actually just be masked by using adaptogens. And you can excessively dose them to the point of overstimulation. And I always like to say, in my opinion, if you're taking enough of an adaptogen to feel excessively stimulated or jittery, or it's keeping you awake at night, or you feel like you just drank a quad shot espresso, you're taking too much. And it's really easy for people to do that with all these phytopharmaceutical products out there that are these ridiculously concentrated extracts of herbs, which have never, there's no real historical use of those herbs in that level of concentration. So I think we do have to be a little bit careful with the adaptogens in that regard. Now, David Winston, one of my teachers, and wrote a book on adaptogens. He has kind of 3 layers of classification based on the research. So one is the true adaptogens, which are the very well researched herbs. These are confirmed, clarified, true adaptogens. Then he has a class of herbs that are probable adaptogens. Like there's a pretty good chance they would meet all of the criteria. So they have a lot of the effects, but it's not fully confirmed by the research that typically is what actually states like this is definitely an adaptogen. And then there's herbs that are possible adaptogens, typically based off of traditional usage, but there may not be as much research on it to really back up that claim that it is an adaptogen. So those are kind of three layers of classification that can be helpful. It's also generally recommended not to just give 5, 6, 7 adaptogens. We kind of have this mode of thinking that if one's good, 5 must be better. If a little is great, a lot must be even better. It's kind of this mindset we tend to have. Oftentimes, a strategic approach to using adaptogens clinically means you're combining them with other herbs that are specifically suited to the situation and constellation of symptoms that the person has. Very commonly, they are combined with nervine relaxants, nervine sedatives, nervine trophorestoratives. I am really, really big on this category. In fact, more often than not, it might seem counterintuitive, but for someone that's fatigued, I will often put them on gentle nervine trophorestoratives and relaxants before I give them adaptogens. I just want to get them getting deeper rejuvenative sleep and get them replete with nutrients and see if that fixes the issue while we're assessing any potential underlying contributing factors to that fatigue. Sometimes the fatigued client has significant cognitive deficits that can be addressed with nootropics. Oftentimes, there can be a significant amount of oxidative stress, so antioxidant herbs can be very beneficial. And then I like to think of affinity-based trophorestoratives. So if they seem to need adaptogens, but they've got an underlying heart condition, we might consider things like hawthorn. Maybe they have their nervous system is burned out, which honestly, I think nervous system burnout tends to happen before true endocrine burnout. No, not adrenal burnout, but endocrine burnout. It's a full cascade. So I really love using milky oat seed. That's probably one of my primary herbs that I use as a nerve-specific trophorestorative. And you've got other herbs here like astragalus as an immune tonic trophorestorative, milk thistle as a liver trophorestorative, etc. Now, again, I do believe there is an importance in dosage with the adaptogens. Don't take enough to be acutely stimulated, but don't take not enough to have the desired effect. So there's a range of effective dosage for these herbs. So for example, with Asian ginseng, Panax ginseng, this is a pretty strong herb. If you're taking a tincture of Panax ginseng, typically a 1-to-5 strength ratio of ginseng can be dosed, 1 to 2 milliliters 3 times a day and be very, very effective. Whereas something like eleuthero or Siberian ginseng, this is a much milder, much gentler herb. This can typically be dosed at a significantly higher rate at a much more concentrated extract. So a lot of eleuthero, for a standard tincture is made at 1 to 4 and is going to be dosed more at 5 mils 4 times a day. So that's literally, if you're taking 1 mil TID of Asian ginseng at a 1 to 5 and you're taking 5 mils of eleuthero 4 times a day at a 1 to 4, that's a significant, I don't know what the math is, but that's a lot more eleuthero for an effective dose. Now, eleuthero is interesting because the original, which, eleuthero came into being really through the Russian experimentation and science done and discovery really, or invention of the adaptogenic category. And those Russian extracts were very, very strong. This was a fluid extract, typically around 1 to 1. Some make it even stronger. You can see 2 to 1 extracts, 50 to 1 extracts, which is ridiculously strong. It seems many companies do more solid extract, so to speak, or more of a thicker extract at about a 2 to 1. And a lot of the research done on Eleuthero is done on the standard Russian pharmacopoeia preparation, which is significantly stronger than your typical 1 to 4 or 1 to 5 or folk method tincture that a lot of home herbalists will do. And this is why a lot of people are like, what's the big deal with Siberian ginseng? I don't really notice anything. Try one of those standardized extracts and it's like, oh, wow, there we go. So we got to be aware of dosage and the concentration of the preparation that you're using. And again, I think the general rule of thumb is if you're taking enough to be stimulated, you're probably taking too much. I think you should take enough to feel more an even keel of balance and energy. If you're feeling jittery, it's too much. You should just feel like, like I don't feel exhausted, but I don't feel overstimulated, right? That's what we're going for, is kind of a mid-level range there in terms of energy. And remember, the herbs aren't actually giving you the energy. They are working with your vital force. And so to me, using adaptogens in a way to help the vital force become more replete is the general strategy for using adaptogens. Whereas if you go over the mark, now you're actually depleting the system of more vitality. And I think it's important that this is coupled with lifestyle modification, dietary modification, and all that other stuff that I was mentioning. So, what are some of our adaptogens? Now, what I want to note here is that, again, true adaptogens, probable adaptogens, possible adaptogens. So the true adaptogens, generally, we think American ginseng, which is our Panax quinquefolius, Asian ginseng or Panax ginseng, Eleuthero, aka Siberian ginseng, that's Eleutherococcus senticosus, rhodiola, rhodiola rosea, ashwagandha, Withania somnifera, schizandra, Schizandra chinensis, cordyceps, the cordyceps mushroom, shilajit, which is the like a mineral pitch. It's not really an herb. It's more of the mineral pitch. And in my opinion, all shilajit comes from the Himalayas. There's claims of other shilajits coming from other ranges. I don't think that's quite accurate. And then another herb, one I'm actually not quite as familiar with, but called Raponticum, is another classically defined true adaptogen. Now, these all have their interesting nuances, right? Asian ginseng, the red Asian ginseng, tends to be significantly more warming than the white Asian ginseng, which is not as warming and a little more moistening. Rhodiola, very, very dry. You're much more likely to overstimulate people with rhodiola. Schizandra, incredibly antioxidant, powerful immune tonic, incredible herb for the liver, great lung trophorestorative. I love Schizandra. This is a fantastic plant. Also very, very astringent, very, very drying. So these all have their nuances in terms of energetics, in terms of their unique focus. I love ashwagandha here because I find it to be, it's strong, but it's gentle in a way. It's not, you're less likely to overstimulate someone with ashwagandha. I love its influence on the nervous system. I also love ashwagandha's application for autoimmune conditions that specifically influence the muscles. So myalgias, various muscle aches and pains, ashwagandha is very useful there for autoimmune conditions that specifically influence the muscles, as well as those that influence the nerves. So again, each of these herbs have their nuances that have to be understood to use them correctly. Probable adaptogens, we have herbs like holy basil, fantastic herb. Lots of interesting actions of that herb. Nootropic, has some antimicrobial properties. It's just like a mint, great digestive, carminative. Very good influence on the immune system, the lungs, the nervous system, blood sugar regulation, of course, very useful property there. Shatavari, this is the Ayurvedic asparagus root, very similar to the Chinese asparagus root. This herb is classically used as a female reproductive trophorestorative. I like it because it's very moistening, very nourishing and building and strengthening. There's lots of other herbs in the Chinese Materia medica that are generally considered probable adaptogens, such as tianqi, ginseng, cinnamomum, sistanchi, and morinda. And then we have possible adaptogens, such as Codonopsis. This is Codonopsis pilosula. I really like this herb a lot. It's called the, quote, poor man's ginseng. Significantly, ginseng is very expensive. Codonopsis, much cheaper, much milder, but very, very nice. Good sweet tonic, good root. I really like Codonopsis a lot. We have Epimedium, aka horny goatweed. Of course, everybody uses that herb as an aphrodisiac in the supplement industry, but it does appear to have some possible adaptogenic qualities. There's other herbs here, such as reishi, maca, licorice root, jiaogulan, guduchi from Ayurvedic medicine. Many of these herbs are possible adaptogens. And again, they all have their interesting and dynamic nuances. Licorice is very moistening, very good respiratory remedy. It's cortisol sparing. So it has, prolongs the effect of cortisol. Reishi, powerful immune amphoteric and immunoregulator. Very, very good respiratory herb, liver herb. HPA axis, not so sure about reishi's influence there. It seems to be more immunologically oriented. My point is, though, is that not all adaptogens are created equal. So we have more of and some of the other distinctions that I like would be, okay, which ones are our calming adaptogens? We've got things like ashwagandha, schisandra, in lower to moderate doses, and very high doses, schisandra can be stimulating. Jiaogulan, cordyceps, these all tend to be calming. Again, cordyceps can be quite stimulating if taken in really high doses. Others can be very, very stimulating. In my opinion, rhodiola is one of the most stimulating. The red Asian ginseng can be very stimulating. American ginseng can be, eleuthero can be if taken in very high doses. Some tend to have more milder effects like eleuthero in moderate doses. Some tend to be very strong like the Asian ginseng, American ginseng, quite strong too. Some are moistening. So American ginseng, moistening, white Asian ginseng, shatavari, cordyceps. Others are very, very drying. Rhodiola. Everybody overlooks this fact about rhodiola. That herb is very, very astringent. It's incredibly drying. Don't ever use rhodiola in someone with a dry constitution. It's just going to aggravate them. Schisandra, also very, very astringent and drying. Now, energetically, we find most adaptogens tend to be warm to hot in their temperature energetic. A few are cooling, so rhodiola is a little more cooling. Eleuthero is a little more neutral. Jiaogulan is a little more neutral, but most tend to be warming in their energetic. Now, some other differentials for adaptogens would be traditional like age ranges. So traditionally, something like Asian ginseng was only given to elderly people, right? Typically, 65 plus. Maybe 65 is not considered elderly. Sorry if that's offensive to anyone. But right, it's not usually given to 20-year-olds. So generally, but you can give it to younger people if they have pushed themselves so hard that they've aged like they're in their 60s or something like that. So, and that's something that we really see with modern culture is that people can push themselves so hard that they age rapidly, at which point, if their physiological state is that of someone that would be more elderly, then some of those herbs can be applied. But generally speaking, some of these stronger ones generally should be reserved for people that are older, significantly more deficient, weak, depleted, cold. Whereas some of the milder ones can be more beneficial for people that are younger to middle aged. I tend to like Eleuthero there. I like ashwagandha there. Those are some of the primary ones that I like to use. I think the important takeaway here, though, is that to really address fatigue, we can't just throw adaptogens at everybody. I'm also not a fan of using too many adaptogens. Typically, I typically won't use more than 2, maybe 3, but they really have to match the person very specifically. And of course, any adaptogen is also given in conjunction with lifestyle, diet modification, really looking at addressing what's causing the fatigue. This is the question you have to ask. And you got to really investigate. You got to be a detective to figure out what is this person doing that's causing them to be so significantly fatigued, or what else is going on in their health that might be contributing to that. So we have to ask the question. Don't just give someone adaptogens and say, have a nice day. You are doing them a disservice. By doing that, you have to look deeper into it. So oftentimes my approach is going to look like screening for food intolerance, assessing sleep deficit, attending to major nutrient deficiencies, assessing chronic stressors, supporting people in effective stress management. Herb protocols typically going to look like nervine hypnotics to help them get deeper restorative sleep, nervine relaxants and trophorestoratives to keep people calm and clear and not being overly anxious or stressed out during the daytime. Oftentimes nootropics to help if there's cognitive difficulty. Sometimes we need to address gut health. We know the gut and the brain are intricately interconnected. So we want to make sure gut inflammation is down. We want to make sure people are digesting and absorbing their foods, their nutrients. That's very important. And if the adaptogens are needed, typically I want to give the ones that are very specifically suited for the individual. So you got to study each of your adaptogens and really understand their nuances. Don't just lump them together. You want to pick the one that matches the person, because that's what we do as herbalists. We treat whole people. We don't just throw herbs at symptoms. And I think also looking at the energetics of the herbs and the constitution of the person is very, very important. And those are some of my perspectives on adaptogens. If you're still watching or listening, thank you very, very much for making it to the end. I know this is a little bit of a longer post than I usually do. I guess I had a lot to say about adaptogens and addressing burnout and fatigue. But, I know I spent a lot of this time talking about not even really discussing the herbs, but that's the important piece and takeaway here, is that that's what you should be doing with the people you're working with, right? Is not so much focusing on the adaptogens, but on the underlying factors. I hope you found this useful and helpful for your plant path. Again, if you enjoyed this video, be sure to like and subscribe and follow us on Instagram, Facebook, the Plant Path Podcast, YouTube. It really does help with the algorithm and exposing our content to more people in the herbal community. It's a great way to help support the channel so we can keep producing good free content for you all. And of course, if you have not checked it out, be sure to head on over to evolutionaryherbalism.com, where we've got all sorts of free content there on our blog, and more in-depth trainings and courses to help you progress further down your pathway towards helping people out in a good way with medicinal plants. So thank you very much for making it to the end and tuning in to the Plant Path. And I hope this finds you well. And until the next one, take care and be well.